Okay, well, look, great to see you. Fantastic that we're all here. Thank you for joining. This is a workshop called The Timeless Importance of the Show. And I'm going to start just with a couple of administrative details. We are recording the session, just so you know. And also, if you've got any questions as we go through the presentation, please put them in the Q&A function as we go, and then we will try and answer them at the end. This session is going to be a presentation that lasts about 35 minutes, and then I'm hoping to do a short exercise with you at the end. It's relatively painless, please don't worry, and hopefully fairly enjoyable. So that's how today is going to run. Just by way of introduction, I am Orlando Wood. I am author of these two books, Lemon and Look Out, published by the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, over here in London, in the UK. And these two books are both really all about creative effectiveness, the relationship between creative style and outcomes, business outcomes. And I'm going to be drawing on these two books as we go through the presentation today, but offering a perspective also on where advertising is today and what our role really should be in it. So without further ado, let's get going and let's talk about the timeless importance of the show.
Mr. Jones and Mr. Krempler were neighbors. They each had $3,000. With his money, Mr. Jones bought himself a $3,000 car. With his money, Mr. Krempler bought himself a new refrigerator, a new range, a new washer, a new dryer, a record player, 2 new television sets, and a brand new Volkswagen. Now Mr. Jones is faced with that age-old problem, keeping up with the Kremplers.
Famous ad for the VW Beetle from the late 1960s by DDB. We've known for a long time that a TV ad might look different from a print ad, and that a print ad might look different from a poster, and that all three can be used to drive growth and profit for your company. But the media landscape today is a great deal more complex than it was in the 1960s. And as we've started to get to grips with the new media options available to us that enable us to target smaller and smaller groups, I think we've started to forget some of the creative principles that were set out by Bill Bernbach and others in the 1960s in the creative revolution. Because a golden age of advertising technology has not been a golden age for advertising effectiveness. We have moved from advertising that looks a bit like this on the right, with narrative, with dialogue, with characters, a sense of something happening in front of us, a sense of place, perhaps also humor and metaphor, towards advertising that looks a great deal like this on the left, that's very close up, just the words on the screen. If we see people at all, we see them as props, just bits of people, their hands, their lips, perhaps a face staring blankly out at us. Short, sharp cuts, no sign of a real place, and a very self-conscious, rhythmic kind of advertising. We have moved from advertising on the right that seeks to create preference and memories towards advertising on the left that seeks a sale. We have moved from showmanship to salesmanship. Both of these schools of advertising have a very long history, going back 100, 150 years or so. Both are important. Each supports the other. But of the two, the more important for profit and for growth is showmanship. And I'm going to try to explain with this presentation today in this workshop why that might be. And I'm going to start by talking about the two dominant modes of attention, two different modes of attention that we have, and how they underpin these two schools of advertising. To understand the human brain and attention, I look to the work of a brilliant neuropsychologist called Ian McGilchrist. Ian is perhaps the world's expert on brain lateralization, how the two halves of the brain pay attention to the world and how they pay attention to the world differently. Since the 1960s, we've had this mistaken idea that both hemispheres of the brain, that each does a different thing. Well, it's not that they do different things. That's not true. It's that each does things differently. They have different take on the world, different priorities, different modes of attention. And just to explain this briefly, the left hemisphere tends to prioritize information within localized brain region, whereas the right hemisphere has more overlap, more associative, more branching. So it's more associative in the way it passes information around. And it has more white matter, that's myelin, that speeds association too. And it's bigger and heavier than the left hemisphere, and it's more sensitive to certain drugs and hormones, chiefly noradrenaline, which helps us with our vigilance and helps us with memory, whereas the left hemisphere is more sensitive to dopamine, which is all about the getting and seeking and anticipation of reward, more goal-orientated. So these two different compositions, these different structures, really, they underpin two different types of attention. And it's not just in people, but in other mammals, and indeed even in birds. When you see a bird pecking around on the ground looking for grubs or grain or worms, that's the left hemisphere controlling the right eye, trying to abstract what it sees from its context, to categorize it, to know whether it can eat it or not. And all the while, the right hemisphere of the bird, controlling the left eye, is bringing a kind of broad and vigilant attention to bear, making sure that the bird doesn't become someone else's lunch. So these are the two types of attention that exist in humans too, broad and narrow. Broad attention, which is always on, which is vigilant for predators and everything around us, the social context that we are in, that understands the whole of any given situation. It understands the living. It's what gives us empathy, that helps us to understand what other people might be thinking. It helps us to understand what they're thinking by their gestures, their movement, their intonation. So the implicit, in other words. And it helps us see the world through a broad collection, really, of different connections and relationships. And it's open to novelty, and it's open to contradiction, and it can well believe that two opposing thoughts might both be true at the same time, which means that it understands metaphor and it understands humor too. It's the right hemisphere that tells the difference between a joke and a lie. And it's very self-aware and questioning of its time and place in the world. And it's what gives us, in fact, our sense of lived time, of space and depth, and helps us to appreciate music too. So this is the right hemisphere. And anything of interest, it passes to the left hemisphere for this narrow beam attention to be brought to bear. The left hemisphere is very goal-orientated. It abstracts things from their context. It breaks them down into smaller parts, and it likes to categorize things and indeed people. It's very explicit in the way that it thinks. There's no room for ambiguity here. It's one thing or the other. And it thinks sequentially in sort of linear terms, cause and effect. It likes to fix things, likes things to be repeatable. And it's very literal and factual about the world, which makes it rather self-absorbed and dogmatic. It doesn't really understand people very well, but it does like things, tools with which to manipulate the world, language, signs, and symbols, a chief of these. And it doesn't really understand music, only very basic rhythm. So quite different ways of looking at the world, different modes of attention, broad and narrow. And in the middle of the two hemispheres, there's a thing called the corpus callosum, which joins the two brains. You can see it in the cutaway here. And it turns out that as well as bridging the two brains, what it's really doing a lot of the time is inhibiting one brain or the other, depending on the task at hand. And so what we find that today in our digital world, and indeed you see this at other times in history, is that as we're spending more and more time up close with our phones, trying to understand the world and the digital world and its new tools that are presented to us, we're spending more and more time in narrow beam mode. And this can cause problems for society, but also, as we shall see, for advertising. If I showed you this symbol, this up here top right, the chances are you'd see it as H4 before you saw all the E's and the 8s. And that's because it's the right hemisphere with this open and broad attention that sees things first. It sees the whole before it sees all the parts. And it's what gives us this sense of alertness and vigilance, things happening just at the edge of our attention, at the edge of our awareness, and helps us with sustained attention and divided attention too. And anything that it deems of interest passed to the left hemisphere for this narrow beam attention to be brought to bear, the E's and the 8s in my example. And as we've been spending more and more time, the habits of thinking associated with the left hemisphere, what we tend to see in culture, and I talk about this in my two books, is this sort of flattening effect that you get with the left hemisphere, a world that's quite adversarial. Anger lateralizes to the left hemisphere, and you get a loss of human vitality. We shall see this in advertising in a moment. Because these two types of attention have a real bearing on the kind of advertising that we make and the type of business effect that we can expect to see as a result. Broad beam attention is what we need to capture with our showmanship advertising. Narrow beam attention is what we need to be thinking about in our salesmanship advertising. Let's have a look at an ad which I think was created to capture the broad beam attention of the right hemisphere. Remember how the right hemisphere is very interested in social context and the living. Let's have a look.
Volkswagen.
This ad presents a social context for us to try to understand. It starts broad and then gradually ends up with the product and its benefit or its feature here. It doesn't assume an interest in the viewer. It seeks to create an interest in the viewer, in the product and the brand. Now let's have a look at another ad that I think was created for narrow beam attention. Let's have a look.
Teeth were made to indulge. With Colgate Optic White Pro Series toothpaste, you can remove 15 years of stains in 2 weeks. Live life to the brightest. Colgate Optic White.
You notice how close up we were with that ad. It's the E's and the 8s in my example. Here we have advertising that seeks to give you a reason why you should buy and to direct you towards the product or brand. And this already assumes a half interest in the product or brand. This is salesmanship advertising. And the advertising on the right is showmanship advertising. And it's towards that salesmanship advertising on the left that we have moved gradually over the last 15 to 20 years. And that poses a problem for us because it poses a problem in terms of your ability to get noticed, to get remembered, and to put things in memory, your brand in memory, through an emotional response. Emotion is very important for advertising, and creating an emotional response in the viewer helps to drive growth because it helps with memory and it's associated with attention too. At System 1, we measure the emotional response that people have towards advertising. Just every ad that airs in the UK, the US, and other markets as well. We show people an ad, we ask them to select a face that best describes how they feel. Right hemisphere is very sensitive to faces and understands how people are feeling. And there are seven basic emotions that we measure based on the work of psychologist Paul Ekman, and we measure whether people feel nothing too, neutrality. Now, over the years, we've looked at emotional response data for over 100,000 ads, in fact, and we've looked at the relationship between emotional response and creative effectiveness, so the ability to drive growth. And what we have established is that the more emotional response you feel towards an ad, the more likely it is that you're going to generate growth, to amplify your share of voice, to make it work harder for you. So that would be at the top end of this scale, the 5-star ads. Let me just explain how that works briefly, based on the principle of extra share of voice, which is a nice way of looking at how advertising works over a longer period. So if you have, just to explain the principle, 10 percentage points of share of market, and you have 20 percentage points of share of voice, you can be said to have an extra share of voice of 10 percentage points, which means that you're likely to grow over the next period by half a percentage point of share of market or more. That's what we're seeing here with this example. That principle is the predicted growth axis for 12 brands here. And then across the bottom, we've got what they actually grew by in the following period. And you can see this relationship between how much you spend relative to your size and growth. But what this doesn't capture, of course, is creative quality. We at System 1 know the emotional response to each of the ads for each of these brands and how much was spent on it. And so when you factor that in, you get a much better explanation of share growth in the following period. It's not just the quantity of your advertising, but the quality of your advertising that counts. And so what you find is that the sorts of features in advertising that drive this emotional response, that are associated with it, they tend to be more associated with things that the right hemisphere is interested in. So here in yellow, you've got the living, animals, people, changes in facial expression, a scene unfolding, animated characters, a sense of context, something happening out of the ordinary. What you find isn't very interesting or emotionally engaging for the right hemisphere is the features associated with the left hemisphere. So this is rhythmic soundtracks, words on the screen, strong product focus, a sort of flatness and abstraction that is so common in advertising today. And what we find is that the features that are more effective, more likely to drive an emotional response, are the ones that have become less common, and the ones that are less effective are the ones that are becoming more common over the last 20, 30 years or so, particularly the last 20, in our digital age. This reflects precisely the time period in which Peter Field, great analyst and friend of mine, has shown the drop in advertising effectiveness on the a.p.e.'s effectiveness database. And at the same time, you get mirroring that in the purple line, the number of short-term cases in the a.p.e.'s effectiveness database that are dedicated towards short-term objectives. The swing to short-termism brings with it this inevitable result, this drop in effectiveness. Because emotional response does two things, really. First of all, it drives your base sales, but it also increases your pricing power, which of course translates to better margins. It allows you to charge more, in other words. And we find this in our analysis of a large set of ads with with Walk. So this is 162 ads we looked at. We looked at their ROI. We tested them for emotional response. You can see this relationship between emotional response and profit ROI. Now, you'll notice that there's a big jump between 3 and then 4 and 5 stars. These 4 and 5 star ads are really fame ads. They're at the very top end of showmanship advertising. And this drives growth in a way that much less emotive advertising does, really struggles to do. And what we find is when you do a massive audit, as we have, of over 100,000 ads, and these are TV ads in the US and also the UK, you find that only 6% of ads achieve those transformational levels of growth. We are, I'm afraid to say, churning out dull. We need a new creative revolution, a bit like the one in the 1960s. And we have been here before. We've been here in the late 1950s. We were stuck also in a salesmanship rut. Rosser Reeves, who invented the unique selling proposition, was perhaps the chief of salesmanship advertising of the time. And he liked to use scientific approaches to lodge this USP through repetition in the audience's mind. Missing here. So what we found in the late 1950s was that advertising's reputation, on account of this very monotonous and repetitive advertising, had hit rock bottom. And it also hit rock bottom because of the reliance on motivation research too. So what happened was we got Bill Bernbach, of course, and DDB, and this was a completely different way of thinking about advertising. This was showmanship. And what Bill Bernbach did was he put copywriter and visualizer together to create something that worked as a whole, unlike the very bitty advertising you can see on the left here. And he believed in approaching things with freshness and imagination, with wit and with charm. And he was a great believer too in emotion and touching the passions. So let's have a little listen to Bill Bernbach and what he said at the time.
The human being is created by nature, really, and there are certain instincts we have which really dominate. And unless we understand that, if we proceed purely on an intellectual basis, we're not going to get very far. There was a pretty intelligent salesman by the name of Aristotle a long time ago who said that you don't persuade people through the intellect. You do it through the passions. Now, it's up to the man who's doing the persuading to tap those passions for good moral purposes. But certainly, that's what does it. I think it was Conrad who said, you can have all the precise words in the world. Just give me the words like glory and honor and all the words of emotion and inspiration.
All the words of emotion and inspiration. Well, Bill Bernbach believed in artistry, and what I'd like to do now is to give you 3 principles that you can take away with you for showmanship advertising. And the first of these is an artistic principle, because as Bill Bernbach put it, only art makes you feel and only feeling makes you act. Let's have a look at an ad and then I will describe what's going on. Here we go.
Hi, Gwen, right? Benji, I live just...
Benji, of course, from...
Yes. Hi. Bit of a weird one, but you haven't been getting any of my parcels, have you?
I love, can't say I have.
It's just I've ordered quite a few things online recently, and with our addresses being so difficult to find, I can see why it might get...
I'll let you know if anything arrives.
emotions revealed on the human face at a moment of revelation. Now, artists in 17th century Italy had a term for precisely this. They called it moto e azione. Moto from movere, meaning to move, so the stirring of the passions betrayed visibly to the outside world, and azione, bodily actions, poses, or expressions marking crucial moments of the story. A kind of turning point, a pivot, an emotional transformation, a psychological transformation on screen here, but also in the audience watching. These artists knew that to create affect, you had to show affect, and that to create, I suppose, to move people, you had to show movement. And if you're going to capture attention, you've got to show intention. Well, if moto e azione was important in art in the 17th century, it's very important in advertising today, because features associated with the left hemisphere, when you look at them in relation to their ability to capture attention and drive an emotional response, are much less likely to do this. Not only less likely to do this, but actually this kind of advertising pushes people away. Unless you're in the buying window already, it's inherently uninteresting. Whereas advertising with features featuring the living, dialogue, implicit and unspoken communication, changes in facial expression, something unusual happening, unfolding before you in the scene with a clear sense of place. This is the kind of advertising that drives attention and emotion, and as we shall come on to see, business effects too. The second principle I wanted to tell you about was the fluent device. This is a term I use to describe a repeatedly used brand character. So this might be, for instance, the Geico gecko, or a repeatedly used scenario, the idea or slogan for which finds the drama in the product. So you're not you and you're hungry, for instance, would be a good one for Snickers. Let's have a look at an example of a campaign that uses this second type of fluent device.
Morning, all. Morning. Brothers, sisters, today a great legacy rests upon your shoulders. Because here, we make more than just tea. We make proper brews. Brews that bring a tear to your eye and warmth to your soul. So go out there and do it for each other. Do it for yourselves, but most of all, do it for Yorkshire! Oh, and the fire drill's Thursday at 3.
Yorkshire tea, where everything's done proper.
Yorkshire tea, where everything's done proper. And that means bringing in celebrities, in this case, Sean Bean, and using them for what they're known for, describing through metaphor the extreme lengths that this company goes to bring you the perfect cup of tea. An example of a fluent device, and a very effective one too. What you find is that fluent devices, either characters or scenarios, are much more likely to drive market share gain and profit growth. This brings me to my third principle. Let's have a look at this ad.
You know, it doesn't matter if you choose left or right because they're both chewy, crunchy, and delicious.
You know, it doesn't matter if you choose left or right because they're both chewy, crunchy, and delicious. You know what else I like?
No, what?
The sound of the snap.
When you bite into it.
The third principle, of course, is humor. Here, the humor of repetition, the two guys, the two tents, the two bears, all to find the magic in the two fingers of the Twix, and of course, that crunch. So humor is extremely useful, an extremely effective creative approach, one that we seem to have forgotten a bit over the last 5 or 10 years or so. So those are my 3 principles for showmanship. There are others, but these are important ones. Moto e azione, psychological transformation, the fluent device, and humor. And when you have advertising that uses these right brain kind of features, what you find is that it's much more likely to drive trust and mental availability. Here, evidenced by analysis of the IPA's effectiveness campaigns. Advertising campaigns that work through right brain features, much more likely to drive trust and fame. And whilst salesmanship is very good at driving direct effects, leading people to a website or downloading an app, or even making a purchase, creating that sale, what we find is that showmanship works across a much broader range of features to create lasting business effects, growth and profit, sales gain, share gain, profit gain. So to conclude, for growth and profit, your show needs to be more interesting, more arresting, and more entertaining than the content that surrounds you. The problem is that I have been speaking to a lot of marketeers in recent years, and they've confided in me that they feel that confidence and experience in creating this kind of showmanship advertising is on the wane. We're forgetting how to do it. And so that's why I've teamed up with Sir John Hegarty to create a new advertising effectiveness course, Advertising Principles Explained, or APE for short. Why APE? Well, because like the gorilla, we believe that advertising too is something of an endangered species. Here we are coming off the stage at Cannes together. A little bit of showmanship never hurt anyone. So why not check it out? But for now, I hope you've enjoyed this little reminder of the timeless importance of the show. Fantastic. Well, look, I hope you enjoyed that short presentation. What I'd love to do now is to do a little exercise with you and then to take some of your questions. So what I'd like to do is to show you two ads. And what I'd like you to do is to tell me either by, well, perhaps it's best if you pop the answer in the chat, and Rupa will help me to monitor the kinds of answers we're getting. What I'd like you to do is, as I show you this ad, I'm going to show you two ads here, but ad A first, I'd like you to have a look at it and for you to tell me whether you think this is a salesmanship ad or a showmanship ad. I've got a little aide-memoire here on the left that perhaps helps a little bit to determine whether we're looking at salesmanship or showmanship. But let's have a look at this ad, and then perhaps you could type your answer in the box. Tell me, is it salesmanship or showmanship? That's the question here. Let's have a look.
Did you know that every single flush flings odors onto your soft surfaces? Then they get released back into the air, so you smell them later. Ew, right? That's why Febreze created new small spaces. Press firmly and watch it get to work. Unlike the leading cone, small spaces continuously eliminates odors in the air and on surfaces, so they don't come back for 45 days. Now that's one flush and fresh bathroom.
So Rupa, I don't know whether we've got anything coming through on the chat. Do we think that's salesmanship or showmanship?
We do. We have quite a few people saying it's salesmanship.
Salesmanship. Yes, well, I'd agree with you. It is salesmanship. It gives you a reason why you should buy. It presents a claim of some kind. And, you know, it's talking to the half interested. Now, this kind of advertising is very useful and very important, particularly with innovation. If you're bringing out a new product and you need to tell people about it, especially when it's a good and new, really new thing. So salesmanship definitely has its place, of course. Let's have a look at another ad. Have a look at this. Tell me what you think. Salesmanship or showmanship?
Good evening, ma'am. Doing 52 in the 25 zone. Have you been drinking?
No, if you're smelling something, it might be my spiked eggnog body wash. It's kind of cinnamony. Oh.
Really cinnamony.
Oh, I'm getting it. Are you wearing something?
My native fresh mistletoe deodorant.
I smell.
Olivia?
This is my Jason.
Husband.
My husband.
So what did we think about that one? Type your answer in the box. What do you think? Is it salesmanship or showmanship? Rupa, are you able to?
Yeah, we have a few answers coming up and they're all saying it's showmanship.
Showmanship, yes, indeed, it is showmanship. Why do we think that? Do you have any thoughts? Are you able to type in and quickly any thoughts on why you think it might be showmanship and not salesmanship? I'd love to hear what you think. And I can give you my perspective for sure. But I think what you find with showmanship is that it starts broad because it can't assume an interest. In fact, it has to create an interest. So it often starts with a sort of social context and then gradually brings you in, draws you in to the product. Yes, Rupert, have we got anyone offering it?
Katie says it's storytelling versus RTBs.
Yeah.
And then we have a response that says plot driven.
Yeah.
Show me, don't tell me.
Yeah, social context for us. The right brain is very interested in social context.
Starts with the audience.
Terrific.
And product segment.
Yeah. No, great. Well, I've got two more now, and this time the task is slightly different. This time I'd like you to think about whether these two ads were created for narrow beam or broad beam attention. Now remember, broad beam and narrow beam sort of underpin the showmanship and the salesmanship schools of advertising. So I've listed some of the features that you might associate with the things that are of interest to the right and left hemispheres here. Have a think also about which ad, if any, has motivazione, and perhaps another way to think about this, if you're looking things at the script stage in particular, is ask yourself, can the ad be described by answering the following questions? Who's involved, what happens, and where is it set? Because if you can, then of course it's more likely to be something that is going to appeal to the right hemisphere and that broad beam attention. So have a think about those questions and have a look at the features. Let's have a look at these two ads. Here's the first one.
Our new collection has just arrived. This week, save 25% on all sofas. Boulia.com.
So what do we think? Was that for narrow beam or broad beam attention? Type your answers in the box, folks. What do you think? And Rupert, if you could let me know what people are saying, that'd be really helpful.
Narrow beam.
Narrow. Why do we think that? Any thoughts on why?
Lack of context.
Yeah.
Don't know what's happening.
Yeah. Yes.
Doesn't answer any of the three questions.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Place.
Absolutely. Quite rhythmic. Words on the screen. Quite abstract, really. I mean, it does at least feature the sofas in context, but it's quite narrow beam, I would say, in what it's trying to do here. Let's have a look at another ad. Tell me again whether you think it's narrow or broad beam.
Hold tight. Text meant for Danny. Sent to Daddy. Relax. I'm your Tanguru. Just blame it on autocorrect.
I meant quiche. I fancy quiche. Like aubergine. We should have an aubergine quiche for dinner tonight. I love quiche.
Time to tango.
I love it.
Particularly British sense of humour there, I suspect. But what do we think? Was that narrow beam or broad beam? Any thoughts? And Rupert, if you could be on hand to help. That would be
broad beam.
Broad beam. Why do we think broad? Is that what people are saying? And why do we think that?
Oh, they're saying clear about what and who it's happening to.
Yeah.
There's dialogue. It's story driven.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's kind of also a moment on which it all turns. It pivots, doesn't it? And that, it's sort of that psychological transformation. By the way, there's a repeatedly used character here too in Amelia, who's the girl drinking the tango there on the sofa, and also the character, the Tanguru, who comes to her rescue every time. You can't know that, but each ad uses those two characters again and again. So it's a fluent device here too. So that
social context of family, it's dynamic, unspoken comments.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the kind of advertising, that drives base sales, that drives profit gain, because of course it strengthens your price sensitivity, so it gives you pricing power. It's also the sort of advertising that helps the business in many other ways too. So it helps with recruitment, helps with retention, and it also even helps you to get cheaper credit, by the way. That's been shown too. So this kind of advertising, this showmanship advertising that we sort of lost sight of, is so important for companies seeking to grow. It's also important for companies who are online too. So in particular online. So yes, questions. Let's do some questions.
There's a question here. It says, are we doing disfavor to the showmanship by contrasting it with salesmanship, especially?
A disfavor.
Yeah, especially when we are all to speak more of the client language and focus on growth. It may imply showmanship is not driving sales, which we know is not true.
Yeah, it's funny. Showmanship is actually much more likely to drive sales in many ways over a longer period. I think the reason I'm using the term showmanship and salesmanship, and by the way, both have a long history going back 100, 150 years, and a long history in America too. You know, if you go back as far as P.T. Barnum, you go back to the medicine shows in the 19th century, you know, this was something that understood the importance of animals, people, the living, showmanship, you know, that put on a show, that thought of our media spaces as something, a place really to entertain and to involve people and to lodge your brand in memory. Salesmanship was about salesmanship in print. This was Claude Hopkins in 1910, 1915, 1920, giving people a reason why they should buy and only speaking to the half interested. And so both of these two schools of advertising, I use the term purposefully. Showmanship means, you know, thinking about, have we got characters? Have we got people? Have we got narrative? Have we got metaphor? Have we got things that capture attention and that lodge you in memory, dialogue even? Salesmanship is something that really is focused on getting that sale amongst the half interested already. They're both important, each supports the other, but showmanship is more important. And showmanship is the kind of advertising that, of course, it helps your salesmanship too. It drives the effectiveness of your salesmanship as well. They both help each other. But that's why I'm using those two terms. And also because I feel that the word brand has lost its currency. So we could talk about brand building and performance advertising if you wanted. But brand feels something very intangible in today's digital world, and showmanship describes what we're doing much better. Hope that helps to answer the question. Any other questions, Rupert? We're probably running out of time, but perhaps we've got time for one more.
No other questions yet, and we're almost at time. We've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Well, look, if you've got another question, pop it in the box, and very happy to take it. But I hope you've enjoyed this short session, and if you'd like to know more about anything I've written, then do check out Lemon and Lookout with the IPA, 2 books, and of course my new course with Sir John Hegarty. Do we have another question, Rupert?
There's a question, is a.p.e. for strategists? And there's another one, I'll read that out too. Can you talk about the relationship between fame, feeling, influency, and showmanship?
Yes, exactly. Well, look, let's take the second one first. So fame, feeling, and fluency. To create fame, really, you need to draw on feeling and create processing fluency, something distinctive. Something actually that I would suggest is distinctive and lives. I think that's the beauty in audiovisual advertising of the Fluent device. You know, it's a sort of living, distinctive asset that's particularly powerful for attention and emotion. So feeling and fluency together can help you to create fame and to lodge yourself in memory. And that they're absolutely key to showmanship advertising. In relation to your question about a.p.e., a.p.e. is for actually, I think what it can help do is to establish a lingua franca, the theme of this conference, between client and agency, between advertiser and agency, give them a common language to talk about what we're really trying to do here and the type of advertising we're talking about, the type of effect that you want to create. And it gives you all kinds of tips and principles on how you can create that kind of work. So it's for the marketing function, it's to support the marketing function, but it will also be very helpful for anyone talking to clients. So account people, also very helpful for strategists to give them the language to talk about it, and even helpful for creatives too. So I think it will work both for advertiser and agency, and particularly well together.
Thank you, Orlando. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining. I hope you've enjoyed it, and would love to hear from you if you've got any questions or thoughts. So do get in touch on LinkedIn, or well, that's probably the best place to start. So anyway, thank you very much.